On this exciting episode, it's a special Halloween edition of the Perry Pod, and you better get ready for the shock of your life. A poetry book is topping the bestseller list. Oh, you thought I was going to mention the whole Perry putting his client on the stand. Oh, you thought I was going to mention the fact that they test somebody's ESP in the lab. Oh, you thought it was going to be the fact that David Gideon actually uses the law library. Yep, that was it, wasn't it? Should have known. It's Perry Mason, Season 5, Episode 6, The Case of the Meddling Medium. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy. My purpose, pretty simple, provide an audio companion to every episode of television's greatest legal drama, Perry Mason. Each episode, we give you a summary of the plot. We even compare plots with the Earl Stanley Gardner novel if the episode was an adaptation. We give you a little trivia, reveal the episode's theme, and revel in a Perry proverb. That's a pearl of wisdom from the man himself, before we head to the water cooler where, just like Della, Perry, and Paul, we can discuss the ins and outs of our fave legal cruise adventures. But first, say it with me, to the law library! When we visit the law library, we search for legal precedents to see if we can find patterns for Perry's future cases. This case involves ESP and whether or not Perry's defendant has it. Would it help her in court? Perry thinks so, because she says she was in a trance, while the prosecutor, Hamilton Berger, thinks she was faking it. So, with an ESP expert, Perry formulates a plan.
If her trance were genuine, it might indicate the presence of some extrasensory perception on her part. We could prove that, legally, no more.
The backdoor approach.
This prompts the larger question. What's the deal with ESP and testimony? Courts have generally approached evidence involving ESP with caution. The legal system relies heavily on what is known as the Daubert standard from 1993, which requires scientific evidence to be both relevant and reliable. And for psychic or paranormal evidence to meet the standard, it must demonstrate a testable theory, peer review, known error rates, and general scientific acceptance. In the 1970s, ESP research emerged at institutions like the Stanford Research Institute. However, the results were often inconsistent or failed to meet rigorous standards. In the People v. Grasso 1989, the court famously refused psychic evidence as unreliable. Another challenge has been distinguishing psychic phenomena from other controversial evidence forms. Hypnosis, polygraphs, those are occasionally admitted. Courts view ESP and trance states, however, as less verifiable since they lack measurable physiological responses. Why doesn't Perry just admit that his whole ESP test was a ruse to get the real killer to reveal guilt? Well, I don't have ESP, but I'm reading your minds, script writers. Now, to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Meddling Medium. We open on a dark, stormy night. Sylvia Walker has a Jones to talk to her poet son, Thomas. The only problem? He's dead. So Sylvia's been hitting up a bunch of budget spiritualists from the Medium Mart, apparently. And this current one's a dud.
He has message for mother. Dear mother. Stop it!
Stop it. Why can't you be honest? Why must you lie to me and cheat me? That glove. That glove that you say can put you in contact with my son. Well, my son never saw that glove in his whole life.
But cousin to the poet Philip Paisley has plans for this medium. Teach me how to look like I'm in a trance and write automatically, he asks. She complies. Next thing you know, we got the harpsichord brigade on the loose.
And Sylvia?
Everything's going to be all right, Philip, dearest. Everything's going to be all right.
Philip can apparently copy bad verse from his poet cousin while in a trance, and he plays this crummy chord all the way to the bank. Open up the crypt. Philip's coming in, and he's super creepy.
The closet with the family skeletons?
An elevator. Tom's elevator. It goes to the bottom of the hill in a small underground garage.
Tom was killed in an elevator accident, wasn't he?
It went out of control. Dropped 5 stories and crashed. Less than a year ago. Tom was trapped inside.
Get it fixed.
But Tom was...
Get it fixed. Or should I speak to Aunt Sylvia about it?
I'll have it fixed.
Ah, that's better. See, you can be nice, can't you? And you're so pretty when you're angry.
But enough's enough. So in comes Perry, who, you know, was just hanging out at a bookstore, hoping to pick up a copy of the best-selling book of posthumous poetry written by our boy Thomas.
I just purchased this book, Life After Death, posthumous poetry of Thomas Leslie Walker. You know, there's been fantastic interest in how you produced Walker's first poem and the rest of the poetry that seemingly came through from a dead author. Quite an accomplishment, Mr. Paisley. Make a book of poetry into a bestseller, you must be proud.
Well, the night devolves, and wouldn't you know, Philip is drunk. Rabbit!
It's no good, I tell you. Can't possibly do anything tonight. The spirit just isn't in you.
Bonnie takes it upon herself to trance it up. What message speak the automatic pen?
A fraud whose hoax turned hope to dread shall take his place among the dead.
Philip promptly goes haywire, jumps in an elevator, and plummets to his death. Really imitating his cousin, I see. Well, someone had to have jacked up the electric wiring on the elevator for it to do what it did, so we've got a couple murder candidates. Not the in love with Sylvia Dr. Younger.
No, Mr. Mason, I didn't kill Philip Paisley. As a doctor, my concern is with saving lives, not taking them. But if I had wanted to kill him, if the thought had occurred to me, I wouldn't have used an elevator. I would have used my bare hands.
Maybe to the smart aleck Michael Craig.
This, good doctor, is what is hopefully called automatic writing. The spirit of the dead guides the hand of the living. A ghost-to-ghost telegraph company, so to speak.
And definitely to Bonnie. And it's Bonnie who's gonna feel that sweet burn of police attention. The only question everyone has is this. Was the trance Bonnie went into real? Enter David Gideon.
Say, Mr. Mason, if you're talking about that murder last night, the one with the mediums and trances, then you ought to see Puharich at the Parapsychology Laboratory.
Puharich?
Dr. Andrea Puharich. I've known him for some time now. He's one of the top ESP men in the country.
Extrasensory perception.
That's right.
So there's an official ESP lab, huh? Here's what Perry gets from his interview with the good doctor.
From a legal point of view, Dr. Puharich, what exactly is a trance?
Nothing evidential that you as an attorney could or would want to take into court.
In court, Hamilton lays out a clear case against our gal Bonnie.
The prosecution has shown that the defendant had access to the death elevator at the time that it must have been tampered with, and that she was seen in the immediate vicinity actually carrying tools. We have demonstrated 2 strong motivations. First, that Bonnie Craig was a woman scorned, cast aside after a sordid affair with a decedent, And second, that Bonnie Craig was a woman desperate to protect her own and her husband's financial security. And we have introduced testimony that under such motivation, she deliberately got Philip Paisley first drunk and then angry, and thus sent him to his death as surely as if she had held a gun against his head and shot him.
Perry does the only thing he can think to do. Get Bonnie in the ESP tryout routine to the ESP library. Explain the trials, David.
Is the Faraday cage ready? Fine, we'll be right over.
What is a Faraday cage?
It's
Go ahead, David.
a way of testing for ESP.
And the results, Doctor.
Bonnie Craig scored 97 correct choices out of 1,000. Neither score exceeds chance expectation. In this test, as in the first test, no extrasensory perception.
But when things go haywire in the Faraday cage, guess who's outing herself? Helen Garden Jacques.
Miss Garden, your back was to that switchboard when the electricity was turned on. How did you know exactly which was the right switch to pull?
Why, I just...
Just guessed? Oh, no, Miss Garden, you didn't guess. Any more than you had to guess how to open the shunt fields on an elevator motor. Now, if we check back far enough, before you went to work for Sylvia Walker, we'll find an electrical background, won't we, Miss Garden?
In the denouement, we discover that Bonnie has the faintest hint of ESP. Here's what smart Alec Michael Craig suggests she do.
Call yourself Countess Bonnie and give readings with an accent.
Oh, Mike.
Ah, yes. Now let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. Adela is a deep dive on an actor or actress who guest starred in the episode. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. In this Paul prompt, I ask you to investigate the testing procedures of our good friend, well, you know how to say his name, don't you?
Puharich.
We had 3 tests in the ESP lab, and as I trust you know, our man Puharich was a real person. So see how these tests match the one Dr. Puharich actually used. Tell us what you find, Pauls. Our Della for this episode is none other than Sonia Wilde, a.k.a. Bonnie Craig.
I'll take an oath on all that's dear and sacred to me.
Here's 10 about Sonia. 1. Born Asheville, 1937. Father, James Wilde, who moved the family to Tennessee to work at Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies. Mother, Marie, interior decorator. Brother, Lionel. She goes on to win, does Sonia, Miss Atomic Energy. Goes to New York City and sees The Boyfriend, famous for being the debut of Julie Andrews, and catches the acting bug. Number 2, moves to NYC to study at the American Academy of the Dramatic Arts, living off a nice allowance from her mom and dad. Number 3, gets the understudy role for Maria in the original production of West Side Story. And when Carol Lawrence goes bye-bye and the show goes on the road, guess who is Maria? Very interesting, a New York Times article featured a pictorial review called The Uncertain World of Those Who Stand and Wait. Guess who was included? Sonia Wilde. Number 4, she's best known for starring in the 1960 film I Passed for White. Here's a feature article on her that says there is at least one who does not apply the word lucky to young Miss Wilde. That person is Fred M. Wilcox, who wrote, produced, and directed I Passed for White. What she modestly neglects to say is that she is one of the most talented girls ever to hit Hollywood, Wilcox says. Number 5, other acting work? Well, apparently, her grandfather was a full-blooded Cherokee. So, Sonia Wilde played an indigenous American in Rawhide, Gunslinger, Cheyenne, and Death Valley Days. Number 6, 1962, marries Jacob Franklin Butcher and quits acting. Butcher, who with his brother C.H. founded an insurance company and an oil distribution business and ran a bunch of banks out of Knoxville, Tennessee, was responsible for bringing the 1982 World's Fair to Knoxville. It appeared to be his moment of triumph. He got arrested 2 years later when federal bank regulators raided many of the 27 banks he and his brother ran in Tennessee and Kentucky. Number 7. The couple, while married, lived in a 40-room white brick mansion called Whirlwind. Guests included Jimmy Carter, Imelda Marcos, according to the book Whirlwind by Sandra Lee, the definitive book on the Butcher's rise and fall. Number 8, found a late article on the fate of this huge house. Quote, Sonia Butcher and 2 of her children came for a private tour of the house and found it bittersweet. They were in town on a sad mission, the funeral of her only sibling, brother Lionel, who was buried in Oak Ridge. They were pleased to see what had been done with the house. It looks beautiful, much as it did when we lived there, Sonia Butcher said in a phone interview. Number 9, Wilde divorced Butcher in 1989. Number 10, Wilde moved to Nashville to be with her mom. Wilde is still alive. The mother died earlier in the 2000s. According to obits for Jack Butcher, who died in the year 2000, the couple had 4 children, and at the time of the obit, 8 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Our Perry has to be about our man's decision to put his client on the stand. Color me skeptical, Paul.
Oh, no. You're not going to let her testify.
Not just Paul, though. Here's Hamilton's reaction.
And let her tell her own story.
What? And let me destroy that story on cross-examination? Putting that woman on the stand would be like giving her a one-way ticket to the gas chamber. No, you won't do that. Perry Mason doesn't make mistakes like that.
It's always good when you can get both Paul and Hamilton to agree on something. And as I've discussed earlier, we know why Perry wanted to bluff the let's put the witness on the stand move to get Helen Garden in that ESP lab. Our theme for this episode, gotta be meddling. Meddling, of course, is interfering in someone's affairs without invitation or authority. But when one person calls meddling, another could call intervention. So, some possible meddling. Dr. Younger.
Arthur, you're a humbug and a fraud. You keep me an invalid only to catch free meals and collect your preposterous fees.
Then there's Helen Garden, who manipulated the books to help Thomas Walker.
I had access to the books.
Books juggled not by Michael Craig, books juggled by you to raise cash for Tom.
There's Philip Paisley. He goes meddling with Mrs. Walker's grief.
Last night was an unfortunate mistake. The old lady smarter than I thought. Princess, there are a couple of things I'd like to know. First of all, everything I can find out about a routine called automatic writing. And most important, your expert help on exactly how to fake a trance.
And David Gideon jumping in with the whole Puharich bit. But what if that was in fact intervention? Was David Gideon helping out? And Perry Mason, that guy's never meddling. Just buying books and conducting an investigation and psychological test to save his client. Don't call him meddling, Mason. It's time for a Perry proverb. I love this throwaway apothegm from Perry.
Back to the river with no boat and no bridge.
The man has a way with words for describing being between a rock and a hard place, doesn't he? But that's not our Perry proverb. The real one comes when Perry's trying to comfort a distraught Bonnie.
You know, frauds have a way of ultimately tripping over the truth.
Especially in this show, Perry, you got it right. Take his advice, Bonnie. Now it's time to grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand. Go on, Paul.
Every time we visit the water cooler, we give you deleted scenes. 3 bits that didn't quite make the episode's final cut. Number 1, we hear more overheated D- grade romantic poetry from beyond the grave, but all about Philip Paisley's immense amount of hair. Shadows fall where man's mane grows unkempt, unchecked, can barely walk beneath his bristling brows, the tangled wreck. Number 2, David Gideon keeps jumping into Perry's conversations with recommended sources. Mr. Mason, if you're talking about that stain on your living room carpet, you know, the one with the wine and spaghetti sauce, you ought to see Dr. Franks down at the Carpetology Institute. They say he's the guy for stubborn spills. I mean, hasn't met a fiber he couldn't restore. Really, David? Number 3, denouement. Della does an informal ESP test on herself with Paul Drake as the other person and gets 10 out of 10, only to reveal she doesn't have ESP. It's just that Paul's so obvious. Those two! Our Paul prompt from the last episode concerns the real-life analog for comic Charlie Hatch from The Case of the Crying Comedian. My dad wrote in with his ballot. Top possibility? Quote, Buddy Hackett. While not a true headliner like Charlie, Hackett had a similar comedic style and evidently had emotional baggage he had to deal with in his career. Honorable mentions, Jackie Mason, an observational humorist with greater cultural emphasis. Milton Berle, big-time star power like Charlie. Too slapstick, definitely an emotionally challenged person. Jackie Gleason, although not a traditional stand-up comedian, Gleason's style and vulnerability matched Charlie's. Close quote. Thanks, Daddy-O. Now it's time for a listener letter. Dave from the UK writes in, quote, been listening in to the podcast, but have avoided contributing to the listener letters as we're not showing season 5 over here in the UK at the moment. I hope that changes soon, though. What prompted me was your recent podcast and one of your listener letters remarking on your, say it with me, folks, to the law library. Well, you've got another convert here, much to my wife's annoyance. I also throw in a keep on walking that Park Avenue beat in at the end for good measure, close quote. Well, I don't want to cause any marital disputes. We all know how that goes, given the fact that they're at the heart of at least 95% of Perry Mason episodes. But in full transparency, if my wife is home while I'm recording a podcast, I'm the one who goes to a closet where I've got a bunch of books and a microphone stand, and I don't inflict the law library call on Britt. It's my own law library, if you will. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Have a comment on the episode or the pod in general? Drop me a line at theperrypod@gmail.com. Next time, it's Dr. Edley in a malpractice lawsuit. His wife's ex-boyfriend tells him he better settle up, but then he comes down with a little case of lethal malpractice himself. It's the case of the pathetic patient. Join us, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!